Pokémon Legends Arceus marked the beginning of a new era for the Pokémon franchise. It was seen as a breath of fresh air for both the series and games, as for too long Game Freak had been pumping the same uninspired crap year after year with little to no innovation. I recently played through Pokémon Legends Arceus and Pokémon Violet, and I have to say, going from Legends Arceus to Violet was surprisingly such a hard task. Pokémon Legends Arceus felt like the true evolution for Pokémon, or at least the direction the games should be going in. On the flip side, you have Pokémon Violet, a game which felt like a regression. Legends Arceus showed me that Game Freak is still capable of making a solid Pokemon game. I've always been a huge Pokemon fan, although my interest in the series has been dwindling as of late, mainly due to the average and sometimes below average Pokemon games. I could never get into the newer releases of Pokemon, they all just felt the same. I was holding out for something different. I really was looking for another Pokemon game to love, and when I first saw the trailer for Pokemon Legends Arceus, I seriously thought it had a chance to be that game. Finally, we were getting a fresh take on Pokemon, and it was good to see Game Freak take a chance on something new instead of rehashing the same old formula. The only criticism coming from fans at the time was that the game seemed rushed. The trailer was clearly an indicator of this, as the graphics weren't anything to write home about, but the new art style was beautiful enough, so I still clung on to the hope that this would be the game to reignite my interest in Pokemon. Move forward to 2022 and the release of Legends Arceus, and I was super excited, and when I eventually got my hands on Legends Arceus, I couldn't put it down. The world felt alive, the Pokemon seemed dangerous, and for the first time in a Pokemon game, I felt vulnerable. I can't remember the last time I was so immersed in the game, let alone a Pokemon game of all things. And yeah, it wasn't perfect, but damn was it a fun, refreshing take on Pokemon. Legends Arceus gave me that feeling I had when I was a kid, playing games like Fire Red, Emerald, or even Soul Silver and Heart Gold. I love how it was a departure from what we usually expect from a Pokemon game, while still incorporating the core elements like battling and capturing wild Pokemon, as well as trainer battles. The brand new catching system might have been my favourite thing about Legends Arceus. The fact that you could walk into an area with 5 or 6 Pokemon you've never encountered and capture them all without engaging battle with every single one is seriously so awesome, and something I sorely missed when playing Pokemon Violet. The Pokemon are an actual threat. Even small Pokemon as annoying as Paris would often try attacking me, and every time I'd have to resist the urge to not just completely obliterate them. It also made a lot of sense for the time period we were in, as most of the Pokemon at that time were very wary of humans, and even the humans living in Jubilife Village were scared of the Pokemon living in the Hisui region, so naturally the fear went both ways. For the players, it meant that you couldn't really waltz into an area without a plan, as you could still take damage from regular Pokemon, and if you weren't careful, black out, which resulted in you losing some of your items. This is where the Alpha Pokemon come in. In my first playthrough of Arceus, while exploring the Obsidian Fieldlands, I stumbled upon a Rapidash. Now this might have been your first experience with an Alpha Pokemon too, but being the fool that I was, I tried to capture this majestic beast, so naturally I took it on in a battle. The battle was over before it began, and my poor Cyndaquil never looked at me the same way. Immediately after, the Alpha Rapidash shifted its focus on me, and ladies and gentlemen, that's where the real fear set in, and I never expected to feel that from a Pokemon game, so that was completely new to me. Alpha Pokemon were a genius addition that raised the stakes, but there was also a reward for taking them on. Not only are they the strongest version of the Pokemon, but if you manage to capture or kill it, you'd receive an EXP boost, or even something to improve your Pokemon stats. The game makes you feel like such a badass when you take on an Alpha Pokemon, especially one of the tougher ones towards the end of the game, and once again, that's a feeling you don't ever get in any of the regular Pokemon games. You can't afford to slip up. Sure, it is possible to get away with 1 or 2 mistakes, but if you're not quick enough to react or dodge, you will black out. Legends Arceus is the first Pokemon game to make me actually care about completing the Pokédex. You're telling me that Professor Oak still hadn't discovered all the Pokemon in Kanto during the time of Pokemon Red, Blue and Green. I never believed that back then, and I still don't. Whereas in Legends Arceus, you're pulled into a time period where it makes sense to want to learn about the different Pokemon inhabiting Hisui, especially since the Galaxy team only just recently moved there, and that becomes quite obvious from the start, as they only ever operate out of the one place, being Jubilife Village. Discovering Discovering and capturing all the Pokemon in the Hisui region is great fun, but more importantly, if you manage to capture all Pokemon, you will get the opportunity to face Arceus, which is the true end goal of the game. I can't quite remember the last Pokemon game that truly gave you the incentive to go out and capture all Pokemon. Sure, it's something that you can do in every Pokemon game, but in Legends Arceus, it's kind of mandatory if you want to capture Arceus himself and complete the final boss. The story itself is pretty decent for a Pokemon game. It's not as good as, say, Black or White, but you're not really playing Pokemon for the plot. And if we're honest, story has never really been Pokemon's strong suit, besides the mystery dungeon games. That's not to say that I didn't find it interesting. Essentially, Arceus takes you, the protagonist, out of your time and sends you to the past, to help the village deal with a looming threat. Your phone is then infused with Arceus' power so that it can update you with tasks, and the goal is of course not to defeat Arceus, but to seek out all the Pokemon of the land. And by doing so, you also help save the world. And this is where we come to Dialga and Palkia. And both of these legendaries were going mad with power, causing everything to go crazy around the world, and by capturing them they are able to be calmed down. I also really like how the main character is 15 here and not 10. It makes way more sense, especially with what they're doing in the game. To help the protagonist on his journey, you have the Diamond and Pearl clans, as well as the Galaxy team. The Diamond and Pearl clans are very present in the game, and I really enjoy the relationship between the two clans. You could sense the hostility between the two groups right from the get-go, and it was certainly believable that the Galaxy team were the ones keeping the peace. And as far as the story goes, instead of gyms, the game had you quell frenzied noble Pokemon. 5 to be exact. All of these events heavily involved the Diamond and Pearl clans, and I really loved this part of the game. Getting the chance to go up against 5 huge Pokemon bosses was seriously so cool, and while not being as tough as an Elden Ring boss, they still put up quite a challenge. Once you learn their skills, it made it easier to precisely dodge and then calm them down with their designated bombs. For a first attempt at a boss, I'd argue that it wasn't bad, but I think there's so much more Game Freak can do to make these noble bosses even more interesting to take down. With all of that said, it was still a fun departure from gyms, but I do think there's room for both gyms and Pokemon bosses like these to coexist in the next Legends game. One of the standout scenes from the game's story was the section where you get kicked out of Jubilife Village, and I think this might be one of the best executed parts of the game. Instead of being a cutscene, the game forces you to physically walk out of the village, and it really feels like a walk of shame. Even the villagers look at you with disgust, assuming you're the reason for all the disasters occurring in Hisui. The soundtrack that plays here is fantastic. The dramatic thuds of the piano help convey the stress, confusion, and urgency of the scene, and it perfectly reflects how our character must have been feeling doing the walk of shame out of the village. Imagine doing so much to help the town with the frenzied noble Pokemon, as well as even helping to complete the first Pokédex, only to be cast out and blamed for all the problems. The protagonist doesn't have much say in the matter, which is unfortunate. Now, if I really had control of the character here, I would not have taken this on the chin. I would have summoned all 6 of my Pokemon and laid waste to the village. If I can't stay, no one can. In all seriousness, I thought this part of the game was executed very well. It got even worse for our character after leaving the village. Both the Diamond and Pearl clans refused to help our protagonist, and it truly seemed like all hope was lost until Volo arrived. Volo was such a good character in this game, but the foreshadowing of his betrayal was shown extremely early on, as he's the one who teaches you the backstrike technique, which is quite literally another way of saying backstab. Game Freak definitely knew what they were doing with him. Now, the final boss fight against Volo was overwhelmingly tough, but still so friggin' awesome. I didn't see any spoilers before engaging in the fight with Volo, so I didn't know what to expect, but straight away it was clear this was the last big fight of the game, and the music to go along with it was just fantastic. Now, I'm always up for a challenge, especially when it comes to a Pokemon battle, and I have to say for the past 10 or so years, it's felt like Pokemon has been becoming quite easy to beat, with no standout battles or tough opponents. Thankfully, Legends Arceus flipped that on its head with this ultimate boss battle. The fight itself has technically 3 waves. The first wave is against Volo's 6 Pokemon who are level 68. The second wave is against Giratina. So it's like you're versing 7 Pokemon in a row, which is bad enough. And if you manage to survive that, you'll no doubt only have 1 or 2 Pokemon left, with probably not much health. For a minuscule moment, you'll think you've won. Then Giratina's eyes flash red, and then you hear a guitar riff, and you know deep down you're not out of it just yet. Giratina transforms into his origin form, ready ready to go another round, and this is the third and final wave. The feeling of accomplishment I had when I finally beat Giratina was something I'd never experienced in a Pokemon game. There are so many oh-no moments in that boss battle that really helped make it stand out from the rest as something truly remarkable. Giratina refusing to die and transforming into his other form was so damn hype, and it's something I never would have expected from Pokemon. Once you've beaten Volo, you're tasked with seeking out all Pokemon to find Arceus, and this is no easy feat. I assume most of you watching have already done this, and if you have, go leave a comment telling me how long it took you to complete the Pokédex, as yeah, let's just say it took me quite some time to finish the first time around. Once again, the satisfaction of completing the Pokédex in this game is really quite unmatched. Getting to meet the god of Pokemon himself, Arceus, was something I had always wanted to do as a kid playing the older Pokemon games. It took 16 years, but we finally got the chance to battle and capture Arceus, and yes, what an amazing feeling. The Arceus boss fight was extremely tough, and if you hesitated too long, you would be punished immediately. Pair that with the knowledge that you're only allowed 3 mistakes before you black out, and it's quite easy to see why this is the toughest fight in the game. However, I'm so glad Game Freak didn't make Arceus a pushover. This is the hardest Pokemon fight in the game against the god of Pokemon, so it makes total sense that he's the toughest there is. I love how Arceus changes types during the battle, practically adapting his type to the Pokemon you send out, which is just incredible game design. I never expected that to happen, but I'm glad it did, as it just ramps up the difficulty even more. Once you defeat Arceus, he congratulates and thanks you, and decides to give you a part of himself to take on your journey. And I believe this isn't really Arceus. Instead, it's only a part of him that's been made to resemble a Pokemon, which makes more sense than a 15-year-old catching the literal god of Pokemon. That concludes it for Legends Arceus and its story, but of course there are a bunch of side quests and post-game stuff that you can still do once you've captured Arceus, and the best thing you can do is reach research level 10, which unlocks the shiny charm. I still see so many people shiny hunting in this game because it seriously is so much fun to do. It's also a lot easier to find shiny Pokemon thanks to the mass outbreaks. One thing I really liked about Legends Arceus that I didn't see many people mention at launch was the stunning move animations. They all seem so intense, animalistic, and powerful, and it really helps highlight just how strong Pokemon are. Many of the blasts and attacks look like they would decimate a human, so it makes sense why the people of Hisui are so wary of Pokemon. Legends Arceus has a legendary soundtrack with a lot of love poured into it. Many times during a playthrough, I'll often stop moving and just listen to the beautiful track playing in the background. With the game taking place in what will be known as the Sinnoh region, it makes sense why so many of the tracks allude to themes from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. The music in Legends Arceus still stands out in its own right, but if you listen closely, you can clearly hear motifs pulled from Diamond and Pearl, and this happens at several points and locations during the game. I was hit with waves of nostalgia when I first roamed around Eterna Forest. I kept wondering why the forest seemed familiar, and then when the Eterna motif started playing, I instantly recognised where I was. It was very well done, and that's just one example. I could talk about the theme from the lakes, Mount Coronet, or even Jubilife Village, as they all sport the same idea with their music, and that's when you know a lot of care and attention has gone into the game's OST. Pokemon Legends Arceus truly spoiled me. I think it's some of the most fun I've had playing Pokemon, and the new releases we've seen in the past 10 or so years just don't come close to it. I'm so glad Legends Arceus isn't just a one and done thing. I know so many Pokemon fans loved this game, as well as all the new additions to make it far more interesting and challenging than its predecessors. I'm sure the graphics could have been improved if it was longer in the oven, but without a doubt, this is the direction Pokemon needs to go in, and thankfully Game Freak realised that, as the next Legends game is slated to release in 2025, with that being Pokémon Legends Z-A. If that game is similar in style, tone, and gameplay, we're in for a treat.